together tonight. I just want to go ahead and say that this for us is a really exciting opportunity to bring regular testing for COVID-19 to one city. It's a chance for us to do our best to ensure safety and health in our buildings. And a lot of credit to our nursing team, Ms. Maggie Felker and Ms. Isabel Perea really have worked hard to find options for us and keep us abreast of all the latest, greatest information. And they are both really hardworking, excellent researchers. And Ms. Maggie Felker heard about our opportunity to do LAMP testing, which was being done at the Eagle School, and reached out to a team of researchers doing this kind of testing with the idea that maybe one city could be one of the test sites. And so tonight we have a great opportunity to hear from our team of researchers at the university, what the testing is like, any questions that you might have about it. So what our program would be at one city or what it could look like. We can also answer some of those logistical questions as well to the best of our ability, and what this might mean for us moving forward as far as having good COVID-19 data at One City Elementary. Anybody? Maggie, would you like to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your role? And then Isabel, you do the same.
Take you off mute.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'm Maggie Felker, the school nurse. Most people don't see my face because I'm working virtually right now. And I do want to give a shout out to one of our parents who's an epidemiologist, Ms. Wajiha Akhtar Khalil, because she was the one who sent me the email to get me in contact with these researchers. And I am excited because, well, for so many reasons, to have guidance, to be learning, to have this available for our families in a user-friendly version. David knows that I always say to make it easy to do the right thing and hard to do the wrong thing. So being tested right on site, we're hoping will be an easy way to give our families the reassurance that everyone's healthy at one city. Isabel, I also want to say that we do have at least one Spanish-speaking mom on. So now and again, maybe Isabel, you would be the best one to interpret, or I could try to interpret too, just to summarize now and again what's going on in Spanish. Isabel, do you want to tell about your role? Because that's an exciting one.
So, hi, so my name is Isabel Perea. I'm the nursing assistant at One City School, and also I'm a biologist and I work molecular biology for many years. So this opportunity to know about the research that they are doing is very exciting for me, and to be able to bring it to the school and try to collaborate with them. So for our families in Spanish, if you have any question, I don't know if you think that I can translate or I can put in the chat in Spanish some information. So
O cualquier pregunta, los que hablan español pueden ponerlo en el chat y pueden escribirlo en español, y de ahí o yo o Isabel podemos contestarlo.
En español puedo decir que es un test que usa Saliva para chequear cada semana si hay algún caso positivo en la escuela. So, cualquier pregunta que tengan acerca de eso, se lo pueden poner en el chat.
And David from the UW, do you have all the documents and the permission slips in Spanish that you'll be sending to us, or any of
right.
that?
So not yet. So hi, so everyone. So my name's Dave O'Connor, and I'm here with Shelby O'Connor, my wife. We're both professors at UW-Madison, and we work really closely with Tom Friedrich, who's also joining us tonight. And, you know, we are still very much at an early stage. And so we want to basically start by having a conversation to answer questions and lay the groundwork for what might be possible as we move forward.
Can you give a little background? I'm sorry, can you just go back a little bit to the beginning? What's going on?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to do. I was going to go even a little further back and say that Tom and Shelb and I have worked in HIV for a really long time. And one of the things that we've learned in working with communities that are affected by HIV/AIDS and working with programs that work with HIV/AIDS is that the community is where the programs start and end and succeed or fail. And so before we talk about what testing is or testing isn't, it's important to get a sense for what the community wants, what the community needs, what the community would like to accept. And every community is different. The One City community is going to look different from the Eagle community, is going to look different from football players at UW-Madison. You know, everyone's going to look different. And so the reason I asked to have a call with a bunch of the parents was in part to talk about the testing, but also in part to just listen and hear what everyone on the call thinks about, you know, about testing, about COVID, answer questions that people might have, because, you know, in our day jobs, you know, we're virologists, so we study how viruses work and how they make people sick. And then we've also been trying to do this sort of testing that we started back in July, where we were bringing a mobile lab around to do rapid high throughput testing. So many of you have probably heard about the sort of PCR testing that you can get done at the Alliant Energy Center. And with PCR testing, one of the things that happens is you make lots of copies of the virus's genetic material, and that's what you end up picking up. That's what the test actually is looking for. Our test does the same thing, but it uses a slightly different way of making copies of the virus's genetic material. And that makes it a little bit more portable. And so actually, if I can have control of the screen, Marilyn, can I get screen sharing? Or if you or David want to show the video I sent over earlier?
Nope, I just made you a co-host.
All right, here we go. Let's see. So a good way to get started is that UW made a video. Can you all see my screen now?
Yes,
yeah?
I can.
Yes.
So UW made a video that describes some of the testing that we've been doing over at Eagle out of our mobile van. And so this isn't the only introduction you'll get to the testing, but it does sort of provide a little bit of an overview about the testing and how it works. And it can give you a sense for what it might look like if we were to do a testing program with one city. Oops, hold on. I think I have to go backwards because I was just using this video an hour ago for a different call. There we go.
So I think next we have a brief video that can orient you to what our test looks like and how it works.
I think it's a great service that could provide me. I could really see this happening easily at all sorts of workplaces or schools. It's just fitting into a tube. You know, it's easy. And it's just nice to know that the people that I'm working with and the students that are here have all, you know, been cleared and they are confirmed not carrying any symptoms with them. So it just definitely gives a peace of mind.
What I'm going to do is give you a tube and a pointy straw, and she can show you how to do the spitting.
So what you're going to do is you're going to spit through the pointy straw into the tube. Try to get the spit from your mouth and under your tongue. Don't pull it from the back of your nose or your throat. We need about this much. And then if it gets caught in the tube, you can blow a little bit and it'll help it sink down to the bottom. So then I'll have you throw the pointy straw away right here in this red trash can. And then I'll have you close the tube and I'll give you this wipe. You can wipe down the outside for me, please. Perfect. And then you can toss the wipe and there's hand sanitizer.
The first thing that we do is we inactivate it. What that means is we heat it up to a high temperature for about a half an hour so that if there's any virus in the sample, the virus gets killed. That means that before we even open the tube, there's no risk to the person who's performing the test. This will become really important when we start thinking about how you scale this out to other places. You always want to make sure that the scientists who are doing the testing are going to be totally safe at all times. After Christina inactivates the samples, she'll take a small amount of the saliva that was collected and she'll add it to a small amount of the saliva solution. and then she'll add that to what's called the lamp reaction. And then the reaction itself takes just 30 minutes at a single temperature. And once we do that, we will take the tubes out, and it will be a really simple color change from pink to yellow if the sample is positive for coronavirus genetic material. The fact that you can do LAMP with much less sophisticated equipment is what allows us to bring it out to a portable lab like this and set it up anywhere.
And so one of the things that we're working towards, so what have we done so far and where are we going? So we've already now run this test since July. We've run it at Eagle School, which is what was shown in the video. We've run it at a couple of UW-Madison campus workplaces. We've been partnering with UW Athletics. We've done testing with the athletic department, and we recently were a bridge program to the availability of daily testing for the football team. We've run about 3,000 tests, and that gives us a pretty good handle on how the assay performs when we're the ones who are running it. And out of those 3,000 tests, we've had about 15 potential positives. So a key difference between a test that you run not in a lab and the sort of testing that gets done at, say, the Alliant Energy Center is that our testing is non-diagnostic. So a positive result by our test is akin to a fancy fever check. So if you are positive by a LAMP assay, that's an indication that you should isolate and get a diagnostic test, but it's not itself a diagnostic test. And that's a really important thing to understand. Now, out of 3,000 or so tests, we only had to give one of these positive results about 15 times. And in those 15 cases, people would get contacted by a doctor who would say, your LAMP test came up potentially positive, you should isolate and go get a diagnostic test. And I think about 9 of those turned out to be real positives that were then confirmed by PCR. And we had about 4 or 5 false positives out of 3,000. So the assay, when we did it, performed pretty well. And the next thing that we want to do, as we're really interested in helping schools get back to being open safely, is we want to set up what amounts to a franchise model. So think about sort of the McDonald's of LAMP testing, where we work with schools to help schools have their own testing programs that they set up, that they run, that are responsive to the individual community's needs, where we help provide the training and we help provide, teach people like Isabel how to do the testing. And we try to make it so that the schools have testing that responds to, whatever the local circumstances of the school might be in terms of how the testing should work. And the reason for this is, eventually we'd like to see this kind of testing available broadly, both in our area and beyond. So, we're talking to One City, we have our relationship with Eagle, we're talking with a local preschool, we're talking a little bit with MMSD. And the idea is that as time goes on, you could have a bunch of franchises, and each of these franchises can run pretty much autonomously with just a little bit of help from us. And so we haven't actually set up any of these franchises yet because One City is the only public school that's in person right now. We thought when we started talking to Kaleem that it would be a really great possibility to talk about partnering to have One City be the inaugural site. And when we learned that Isabel had a biology experience, it seemed like this would be an even better fit because she would be a logical person to be the lead on sort of franchise 1. Tom, do you have anything you'd want to add to that?
No, I think that that covers it pretty well. So this is something that we hope could be a decentralized model. So it's a way that ultimately schools can do, as Dave said, a fancy fever check, so that parents and teachers and staff and students can all feel safer about being back in school. I do see there were some questions in the chat that are very good questions. So I would like to address those questions really quick, if I may, because I think they're worth unpacking a little bit. So people have asked about false negatives and false positives. So as part of our research program to evaluate this test, we've been paying very close attention to false negatives. One thing we haven't explained yet is that we expect that this kind of test it's important for what we would call infectiousness testing. So what we want to do is prioritize detecting people who have amounts of virus that are consistent, that would be expected to make them contagious to other people. The PCR tests that we've been hearing so much about, like the kind you would get at the Alliant Energy Center, they're very sensitive, meaning that they can detect very small amounts of virus up your nose or in your saliva. But we know from other studies that such very small amounts of virus probably don't mean that a person is contagious anymore. They could test positive without being contagious. And so we think you don't really need that fancy of a test to detect people who are contagious. The test that we've been doing here isn't as sensitive as PCR. So we would expect that some people who test negative in our test would test positive by a sensitive PCR test.
Do you want to hear about it? You want me to give you the link so you can listen to it? So
there you go. But we think it's okay to be negative in our test, but positive by PCR, because that would mean that somebody doesn't have an infectious, a contagious level of virus. And so the goal is to test rapidly and find people who are contagious so that they could isolate quickly. And then they would be referred to get a diagnostic test, a PCR test, to make sure that they're truly positive. So that's the way the test works in our program.
So,
Hey,
so
Tom,
Tom, let
that
me add one.
Oh, I'm sorry. That was just such a
question.
clutch statement right there that you gave about the value of this test, I think. I was wondering if you could just kind of sum it up in like 2 sentences so that everybody can extract that last bit, that you could have, this test really helps us understand if you're contagious or not, right? That's one of its real great benefits. And then if also we could get that translated to Spanish briefly.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
go ahead, Tom. Well, so we want to find people who are contagious and get them out of circulation, is the test in a sentence. Yep. I do think it's important to answer the question directly, though, which is that as part of our testing, we took about 2,500 of the 3,000 samples that we've run so far, and we also ran them by PCR to figure out how many false negatives we had. And the answer was virtually none. Now, that is a little bit misleading. The assay doesn't perform as well as that would indicate, because we were testing people who were healthy. So most everyone was really negative. If you use the LAMP test at a UW dorm that's highly affected, you are certainly going to have false negatives. But we did look at this over like more than 2,000 samples and didn't have false negatives. But again, that's kind of a misleadingly good statistic. But again, the key idea is that whether it's with the LAMP testing, which is the sort of testing that we're talking about here, or the next sort of testing that's probably going to eventually replace LAMP testing, what's called antigen testing, the idea is the same thing. Less sensitive tests can pick up people who are contagious, and getting people who are contagious out of schools is what you need to do to keep the virus under control and to make the risk at schools as low or lower than in the community. Because there was some great data that just came out this week that said that more than 75% of all infections are caused by as few as 5% of the people who are infected, because 5% of the people are putting out huge amounts of virus, while most people are putting out only a little tiny bit. And so we want to find those people who are putting out a huge amount of virus.
Can I add one thing is it's not that we want to be able to use the test to keep your school open or to, basically to keep your school open, but you guys are going to school, which is great. And all the kids we know need to be in school. And this is just a way to help make sure that all the staff and students feel as comfortable as they can be while being there. that.
So another question in the
Well,
chat.
hold on. So, before we do that, David or Isabel, do you want to translate that into Spanish? The key concepts there?
Oops.
Okay. So the test, perdón, ellos han testeado como 2,000 muestras y en esas no han encontrado que haya como incongruencias con los resultados negativos, pero de todos modos saben que la prueba que hacen en Alliance con PCR va a ser más ajustada a la realidad que la prueba que hacen ellos, pero al hacerlo más de seguido, pueden tener como yeah, I forgot how to translate into Spanish. Pueden tener una visión como más general de los resultados. Y aunque eso no va a garantizar no nos va a garantizar que la escuela va a estar abierta solamente porque ellos estén haciendo esos resultados, pero va a darnos como una seguridad de que vamos a tener casos de que no van a ser contagiosos. Las pruebas de ellos van a excluir a esas personas que pueden contagiar porque la cantidad de virus no es tan alta para poder contagiar a otras personas. Por eso es que dicen que no es tan sensitiva como la prueba de PCR que hacen en Alliance, pero sí da la seguridad de que de esas personas que tienen una gran cantidad de virus van a salir positivos y no van a contagiar a las otras personas. Es como que vamos a excluir a esas personas que que pueden contagiar. Right, Maggie?
Sí, sí. Entonces la meta es excluir a las personas más contagiosas, porque esas personas, aunque sean como 5% de las personas afectadas con COVID, un pequeño porcentaje puede contagiar a muchos porque son muy infecciosos. Sí. Okay.
Excellent. David, does that capture kind of the basic idea for you?
Well, if you're asking me, I guess I couldn't say because I don't speak Spanish. But
well, I mean,
yes. That's exactly. I wanted to stop and get that out. So absolutely, Tom. Please pick up with the questions.
Sure. So there are a few questions about how long does it take to get results, how often do you test, things like that. So I'll take a couple of those and then I can throw over to Dave and Shelby too. So how often you test is a really important question. So a lot of scientists have put thought into how frequently you'd want to test people to catch those who are infectious, who are contagious to others, but don't know it yet. So that's a big deal with this virus, is that people can have infectious amounts of virus in their bodies, but they can feel fine. They may develop symptoms later, or they may not, but they could be infectious to others without having symptoms. And so you want to test somewhat frequently to catch people who have gotten infected recently, but don't have symptoms yet, but may still be contagious. So you'd have to test regularly. Some people say that should be twice a week. Some people say it should be every other day. You know, if you're in the White House or in the NBA, you might get tested every day. But it really kind of depends on the program. And I think those are details we'd have to work out. And exactly how it would go, like in a class or you know, at home, or these are all things that we've considered different ways of doing it. And And because this is a really early stage, we're not, we're kind of open to doing it in the way that makes the most sense for one city. In terms of getting results back, the way that we do this, because this is not an FDA approved test. So this isn't a test that anyone can use right now to say, you person who got tested have COVID, or no, you don't have COVID. What we do is find out who tests positive with this test, and then they, in the studies that we've been doing up until now, they get called by a doctor and told, you had a result of concern, and you should isolate, and then you should go get a PCR test, an approved test. So it's a way of sort of flagging people who should get that test, and making sure that they stay home while they're waiting for that test to be done. But we can't use it to tell you you don't have COVID or you do have COVID. Does that make sense?
So, while we're waiting for anyone to answer that, I'll just add one point to what Tom said, and that's where I think the community is going to vary from place to place. So as I said, you've probably seen that Big Ten football is resuming, and we can set aside whether or not that's a good thing or not. As scientists, we're not big fans of it. That said, it was going to happen one way or another. So we thought it was better for it to happen safer than less safe. And so they're moving to a daily testing model. And so for them, they wanted to bridge to the availability of the daily testing, which started this week, that was provided by a third-party company. They wanted us to do daily testing with them. And so we did that for a couple of weeks. For that community, daily was the interval. For other communities, weekly might be the interval. For some, it might be twice a week. This is where I think it's really going to vary, because there's sort of competing tensions. You have the tension of, how often would it be ideal from the biologic perspective and the epidemiologic perspective. But then you have, how many people are actually going to be trained in to perform the test, and who's going to be running it, and how much it's going to cost, and all those other features that all sort of intersect, and you have to weigh all of them when deciding how to structure a program. And my guess is that a program at one city would have some of the same broad contours as programs at, say, MMSD, where they have like a much larger cruise ship to navigate, but would differ in some of the key details. And that's where it's so important to start the conversation with the community and figure out what it looks like with the community first, before doing any work on actually doing it, and instead of coming at it the other way around. Okay, so I do see we have another question about keeping saliva. The question is, I assume that you'll keep all your children's saliva in a repository. Can you tell us what our kids' saliva can be used for? So actually, it's an interesting question. So we do keep saliva for a short period of time, and that's so that we can do the sort of quality control that Tom and I talked about earlier, where sometimes we want to run our negatives in an in-house PCR. Again, it's not diagnostic, but we want to make sure that our negatives are really negative. Tom and I also sequence the viruses from people throughout the state of Wisconsin. So we're sequencing the viruses from Milwaukee, from Dane County, from this week we got involved in sequencing from the Sturgis motorcycle rally up in South Dakota. So there are some very applied things that we can do with the saliva for like a week. If you had positive cases in the school, getting the sequences of some of those viruses might be useful for helping to guide a public health response with the support of public health authorities, not us, but with public health authorities doing that. But other than that, we don't have infinite freezer space. And so we have no desire to bank people's saliva for any sort of long period of time.
I also think that if you add on to that, what one city decides to do as part of their testing program, keeping saliva is kind of up to you guys too. If you're going to be testing students at one city, if you don't want to keep their saliva, toss it out.
Yeah, that's true. So I answered a different question, and that was, and Shelby's absolutely right to call me out on that. So again, a surveillance program that's being run by one city makes the rules. What I just described is the way that we've been doing it as part of our research for the last several months.
So I just added this in the chat also. I was actually ready to hit go when Dave started answering that question out loud. But that's exactly it. So I think in terms of keeping samples, it would be up to one city to decide with in your own community what you feel comfortable doing. There are reasons to keep saliva if you wish to do that for the short term, but you may not wish to, and that would be completely fine.
I saw that there were some other questions in Spanish. Isabel, were there any of those that you'd like us to address?
Or Maggie?
Sí, so one of the first things that they put in Spanish is like that they think that is a very good test for children because they don't like anymore to put them to do the other tests at Alliance, so they don't want to do it anymore because it's a little bit painful. So then they were talking about this in the chat, and then they just said that that they feel good because the school is trying to keep our kids safe, and then the same thing they were talking about the nose test, and also that is a faster test. So they didn't have some questions in Spanish, but there were some comments about the difference between the two tests. I just see here one question in English from Wajiha that some recent news suggested that some companies are abandoning speed testing. What makes lab testing different? And I remember that we talk about the different testing that that they are developing and how they are going to be later. So maybe if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yes, and I should also just start with, disculpe, nosotros falamos un poco de portugués, mas no falamos español.
Suena igual al español.
So that was an article that was in the New York Times yesterday that talked about these antigen tests. And so antigen basically is a fancy word for bits of virus itself. And those tests, there was a lot of hope in the summer that you would have simple spit tests that would be like home pregnancy tests where you would spit on them and they would just turn colors if you had a positive. And companies that were developing these tests looking for the bits of the virus itself have moved away from saliva. Saliva remains a really good place to look for the virus's genetic material. In fact, our testing was noted in the bottom of that article as an example of how saliva testing is still useful. I went back and forth with the reporter who wrote that article yesterday, asking like, why is it that the virus bits can't be picked up in the saliva? Biologically, it doesn't make a lot of sense, and we don't really know. But when you're looking for the genetic material in saliva, it seems to be really good for that, like really, really good. It's stable for 5 days or so at room temperature. But looking for bits of the virus itself that are not the genetic material, it seems to be less stable for reasons we don't understand. So you may have heard the NBA had their restart program down in Orlando. That was supported by saliva testing, where they actually compared saliva testing to nasal swab testing, and they were virtually identical when they tested the same samples from the same people every day for several months.
For genetic material.
When looking for genetic material. That was by PCR, but it underscores the idea that looking at saliva is fine. There was just new data from Japan this week that looked at thousands of people who came through airports in Japan, looking at genetic material in saliva and in nasal swabs. And again, saliva was just fine. So for genetic material, saliva is still great, but for looking for viral proteins or bits of the virus itself, it doesn't look to be so good.
So there's a couple of questions in the chat that I noticed, and I was hoping we could address them too. Maggie had asked a couple questions about labeling samples and how to associate those with individual kids. And I could say, Maggie, that for the work that the testing that we've been doing, we have a coding system in place to be able to link up individual samples with individual people. But again, this sort of gets back to that idea of what does one city want to do and how would you guys want to encode individual kids with IDs to be able to keep track of their samples. And I think that's a conversation that we'll have to have with you, and we can show you how we've been doing it. And then, you know, you will have to decide with your community what works best for you guys. Dave wants to show something.
Well, so for example, you know,
move it closer.
You can't really see. This is my identifier for, it's hard to see. It says 0098. So when for our testing now, when we do it, someone who's already registered can just show a card, and then we can give them an identifier that we use for the day if they already have one. We're working towards being able to send people home with test kits that they can then just bring in and drop off that are already pre-labeled. And basically it's about options, and it's about what works well for each individual, school. And our feeling is, again, sort of following this franchise model, we intend to provide some training and practices on how we do things. And then the expectation is that people will listen to that and will decide if that works for them or if they want to take a different route. Again, the idea is that the way that this all is going to get done is going to be through, a school-led surveillance program that has the flexibility to adapt to whatever the local preferences are. And that actually goes to another question that's in the chat right now too, of is the testing for children or for families? It depends on how the school wants to configure the testing. And these are the sorts of questions that as a community, require discussion. You're not going to answer them on this call. You're going to have to talk to various subgroups and figure out, what are the resourcing, and resources are both the money to perform the test, which is also going to be a question that someone's going to ask. So I will answer it right now. It costs about $5 to $7 per test in supplies to run the test. And so you multiply that by the number of tests that you want to run, and you can pretty much then figure out your supplies budget. You then need to figure out, the staffing. So one, small team of people, so Isabel plus a helper, could probably run through about 100 samples a day. How many days of the week would you want Isabel, or if there was a team that had a couple of people, one team with Isabel and one team with someone else, how many days of the week would you want testing to be run? How, these are all questions that require a lot of thinking, but it's basically how you can imagine tailoring the program to whatever the local needs might be.
So
Good question, Kaleem.
Yeah, we'll we'll raise the money to do the test. And someone asked us, are you guys paying for it? They're gonna cover the first month, but we'd have to do it after that. So, but I'm not concerned about our ability to raise the money. Be nice if some of the parents want to help though, because folks love listening to what you guys have to say.
there was a question that got missed. Can the parents be involved in testing, for example, to encourage their kids to take the test? And is the test only for children or for families?
So right now we're looking at it for our staff and our children. If we did families, there's a lot more cost added to that, and even time labor. So right now we have Isabel, and we'd have the lab as a potential backup to help if for some reason she couldn't. But the more people we decide to test, the more people we have to staff that. So that would be something we can consider, but it's a long shot that we would be able to do all the families.
However, the comment about parents encouraging their children, I leave that up to the parents. You're obviously welcome to talk to your kids. And then there was the question about, can parents volunteer to help with the testing, I guess is the question. I think that's up to the One City community and how you like to handle that. There are jobs that require some more scientific skill that can be learned by a lot of people. And there's actually quite a lot of just organizing of samples that doesn't require much scientific skill, but just requires the like an organizational mindset to put things in order and number them correctly so that you can keep track of everything.
Yeah, so just let me comment on that briefly. So as I said in the video, you may have missed this point because it went by kind of fast. The test is very safe to perform in that after someone provides saliva into a tube, the tube is closed and the tube isn't opened up until any virus that might have been in that tube is completely inactivated and completely destroyed. So from the perspective of safety, it's really safe to have pretty much anyone handling those closed tubes, putting them in a heating block and then heating them up. I would be very comfortable having my 12-year-old son do it. The challenge is, you do have to try to avoid contamination between samples. You have to try to make sure that you don't have samples, turning positive because, you accidentally, took some liquid from sample 1 and popped it into sample 2 or something like that. And as Shelby said, those are all learnable skills, and how exactly you decide to distribute the effort is something that is going to differ from place to place. But again, figuring out how to task shift from having professional scientists running this test to having individual, franchised schools running the test is like why we want to invest the effort in this to help get it going at One City and elsewhere. We think it can be done. The analogy that I like to use is that, Tom and I work a lot, or at least have worked a lot in Uganda in the past. And in 2007, it was shown that if you were circumcised, if you were a man and you were circumcised, your risk of getting HIV was reduced by 60%. And so suddenly you have a country of people who as by and large were not circumcised and who are at high risk of HIV. And so they needed to figure out how are they going to get an entire population of people circumcised in places like Kenya and Uganda. And so they task shifted the process of circumcision away from surgeons to people who didn't have medical training. And so my thinking is that if you can teach people to cut a foreskin off a man, we can teach them to pipette things and run a COVID test.
Just to add on to that though, there are, again, certain parts of the job that aren't necessarily requiring much scientific skill. For example, if one were to make take-home kits for the kids to take home and spit into and then drop them off when they get to school in the morning, labeling a bunch of tubes and putting them into bags and organizing them with a kid's name on it, that doesn't require much scientific skill. It just requires a lot of organization. Oh, there's more questions.
Oh, I see there's a flurry of questions and a flurry of questions around cost and sustainability. And so this is actually a really important point. And so Tom and I and Shelby have been talking about this a lot today, both with respect to One City as well as some of the other schools. And so, Tom, I think you had the most articulate way of phrasing it. Would you like to take the lead on answering this one?
About cost and sustainability, I don't know if I'm the most articulate person there. But I think this is something that hopefully will show some value. I think as we've been saying, it seems like there's a lot of interest in it. And so, the point is to hopefully make it become sustainable through support from the community. So if there are, if we can show by partnering with One City that this is something that is acceptable to kids, that is acceptable to parents and faculty, and we can kind of, collectively show that works, then I'd like to say that we could build a constituency to support it.
So, in answer to like how it would look operationally, our thinking is that, initially for like the first month, as Kaleem was saying, we want to make sure that people see what the testing is all about, how it works. And so we can do that under our existing research study. We can come over sometimes and do it. We would need to consent people under our research protocol. And I see Elizabeth Felton drew distinction between research and surveillance, which is excellent. So initially, because we want to get this off the ground quickly, and we have the approval to do this out of our mobile van right away, we can come and do some demonstration days while we're working through the process of setting up what a fully fledged franchise looks like. Now, that fully fledged franchise looks like a one city run surveillance program. There would be a cooperative agreement in place in all likelihood with UW-Madison that sort of highlights the fact that it's a one city schools program where we're providing some advice and guidance and some technical assistance, but it's really a one city program. My expectation is that that would take, round about a few weeks to a month to put together. During that time would be when we would be trying to answer questions like this, but instead of in Zoom, in person, through actually doing some of the testing, showing it, and we would pay for that, and we would be able, because we have all the stuff in the lab already to do it. But the idea is to then use that as a bridge to a franchise and get that franchise stood up, as quickly as we can, which requires just some conversations between Kaleem and the school and UW.
Yeah, I think that just to underscore that, I mean, this is something that we need to respond to a public health crisis in our community now, and we're all figuring out what is the best way to do that. In a setting where no one's ever done anything quite like this before in the community. So, it is our goal to, when we initially designed the test, to make it be something that could be done by, by just kind of regular folks. So we're excited that one city is interested in doing this, and we want to help. I think it's also worth saying on the training side that there's a group that has been working in the city of Racine to try a somewhat similar approach, and they're actually training firefighters to do some of the testing. So like you bring your samples to the fire station, and the firefighters will do some of the actual like pipetting of samples and stuff, like do the testing. So I think if they can train firefighters to do it, we can help train people here in our community to do it also.
But I do want to set expectations that, I guarantee you there are going to be road bumps, and I guarantee you there's going to be problems we can't foresee. And task shifting this is something we have not done with this assay. Like, I have taught people in Brazil how to, do other molecular biology in the past that they haven't done before. And you run into things that you don't expect. So like, I don't want to present this as like, you go in on day 0 and everything's perfect. It almost certainly will not be. What I can tell you is that our experience since July has been really quite positive. The things that we really worried about turned out not to be such problems by and large. There's, again, moving it to a model where the schools are in charge of their own programs also addresses some of the other things that I see in the chat. Like Grace asked about the price per test. So the $5 to $7 is as we run the test, where we run each sample twice. We run, each sample in what we call replicate. So we basically take the sample and we put it in well 1 and we put it in well 2. And we do that just to be sure that our results are right. Well, if you decide that, it's more important to be able to test more people with the same amount of money, maybe you don't run it in duplicate. You accept the fact that you might have slightly more false positives or slightly more false negatives because you're only going to get a 1 of 1 readout, not a 1 of 2 readout in some small number of individuals. And then that reduces the supplies cost not by exactly half, but pretty close. So that reduces it to like $3.50 to $4 a test.
And staffing.
And it reduces staffing because you have less, manipulations of materials you need to do. It probably cuts 20 to 25% off your staffing. So, it's those sorts of decisions that like UW Athletics, who's flush and who like wants, gold-plated service, wants the replicates and everything else, wants it daily. A testing where you're trying to make it as accessible to as many people as possible. Maybe you're not as constrained in terms of getting samples because you have a lot of parents who can help, with the sample collection and everything. And then you just run each sample once so that each test is a little bit less expensive. These are sorts of decisions that, get made at the school level. And we can provide some advice. Like we would tell you, no, don't do that. That's a terrible idea. But a lot of these are decisions about how to make a program that works for you. And, there's a lot of space within that to craft it in a way that makes the most sense.
Toya just had asked about what were some of the hiccups, because David mentioned some hiccups when you try to start this somewhere new and what needs to be done or not done prior to spitting. So some of the hiccups that we had to do kind of with like weather. For example, it's a windy day or it's really hot out, and how are you going to deal with these different conditions? And so some of those hiccups became issues. Also, another hiccup sort of actually has to do with what has to be done or not done prior to spitting. So for example, when we first started, we said, oh my gosh, some people can't spit because there's some people who have a tough time spitting.
Tom, we're looking at you.
Yeah. And so we said, well, let's have those people chew gum because gum chewing is going to help them spit better. Lo and behold, we finally learned pretty quickly, actually, that chewing gum actually can reduce the sensitivity of this assay. And so we can't detect virus as well in someone's saliva who has been chewing gum. And so we learned the hard way that, maybe the hard way only because I had to do a big experiment about it, but we learned that chewing gum can mess up the results. And so now we're trying to encourage people not to eat or drink, within about a half an hour before they participate in the spitting test.
Yeah, and if, we had someone who was chewing gum last week, so we had to so now we ask, are you chewing gum or have you chewed gum recently? And if they have, then we go have them swish their mouth out with water for 30 seconds twice, like you would at the dentist, to get the gum residue out of their mouth, because otherwise the assay is not going to work. So, it was things like that. We had issues. Let's see, what else do we have? The gum was a great example of that.
We also learned early on that everyone's spit is just a little bit different. Some people's spit is really thick and goopy. Some people's spit's not. Some people, maybe there's a slightly different color. I still don't understand that. But we've also learned that the whole premise of the test is based on a particular molecular change, and due to some people's saliva, the test may start kind of orangish or yellow, and we're looking for a change from pink to yellow instead of yellow to yellow. We can't detect the difference between yellow and yellow, and so we learned early on we need to pay careful attention to our samples before we run the lamp test and after we run the lamp test, again because everyone's saliva is so different.
Yeah, and I mean, the other big hiccup is, and we're trying to address that by doing this. One of the first places we tested when we started was Eagle, and we were testing teachers and volunteers, and we made the mistake of basically saying, at that time, no one had made any decisions about what they were going to do for the fall in terms of school. And so we said, well, we don't want anyone to get expectations up about what the testing might or might not provide in terms of supporting the school reopening. So we'll just kind of do this soft, quiet testing of small numbers of people at Eagle to figure out like how you drive a mobile van around to perform the testing. And we did that. And it was all of about like a week, maybe less, before we started getting blowback where, the rumor mill had it that like, Eagle was going to be getting testing and that this was going to be used to reopen the school in the fall. And that wasn't the case at all. But we hadn't engaged with the community enough. We had instead decided that we, would try to, avoid creating problems And we ended up creating a bigger problem for ourselves. And so that's one of the reasons why we're starting with the community now. And that's going to be our model for the franchise is, you know, every place we're going to try to do this. We hope to start with one or more than one meeting like this so that we can answer questions and get people on the same page about what it is and what it isn't, so that we can hopefully minimize, you know, that amount of friction, which was completely of our own doing. It was our own fault, and we shouldn't have done it that way. So it's that sort of thing that we're trying to do away with.
So it looks like Danielle had also mentioned a comment about the kids would like spitting rather than getting a nose swab. And just to add on to that, I've had a few examples of kids who've come out to the site specifically because they can't handle the nose swabs, like a kid whose nose might get bloody, or a kid who has autism and just can't handle having someone go into his nose with a swab. And so, you know, being able to offer up a spit test as an option that's not the nose swab is really beneficial for a lot of families.
I would add to that too, that among the kids that we've tested in our research study, like once you start talking about spit, every kid I have talked to has just really enjoyed talking about spit, let alone actually spitting. So they've really enjoyed the whole process, and I have not come across a kid yet who wasn't able to do it.
So I see Toya has some questions about logistics. So like, does quantity matter? We don't need very much. We need like about a teaspoonful, maybe a little bit less. It's not very much. You know, normally it's, you know, you just work it up under your tongue and you spit into this little pointy straw and you get enough. We have not had a problem where, you know, kids can't provide enough or don't have as big a mouths or anything like that. The kids are actually tend to be just fine. And the question is, would it need to be outside or inside the building? Again, in the immediate short term, when we would be maybe doing some demonstration testing, our protocols for doing the research testing have us doing things, collecting samples outside. But when it becomes a surveillance program administered by the school, that's for the school to decide exactly how they want to set it up. There are, in general, for the coronavirus, outside is better than inside, all other things being equal. But that becomes a little less tenable once you get into the colder winter months.
But we came over and met with David and Isabel last week and identified possibly a space in the loading dock area. So the goal is to be away from the kids. So if there's a concern at all also about whether or not we be testing right next to where the kids are doing their schoolwork, the answer to that is, you know, we don't think that it's necessarily a good idea to be performing the test next to areas where the kids are doing their schoolwork. Again, it is up to Isabel and David and Kaleem and your community to decide the best venue, but our encouragement or our suggestion would be that loading dock space, which is a good area to do it. Mm-hmm. But again, it does become your decision.
And for those that are familiar with the building, if you're facing the front door and look all the way to the right where the dumpsters are, that's a loading bay right there, and there's a garage door. So it's almost kind of an inside outside solution for the colder months that we can use. So we're committed to using that space.
So there's a question about N95 fit testing. So again, it depends entirely on how you end up configuring the testing. So to set expectations appropriately, when we're doing the demonstration, you'll see us consenting people and having people collect spit while wearing N95s, because that's what the UW's Office of Biological Safety has in our protocol for doing it. So we have to abide by that. If you were to use take-home kits where kids are unsupervised, there would be no in-person consenting and no in-person tubes. So obviously then you wouldn't need it. It's advisable to be fit tested to wear an N95. If you're Isabel or working with Isabel to perform the testing, our protocol has us doing that, wearing N95s. It is, again, you know, technically it's a what we call a biosafety level 1 activity once you've heated the virus, so the samples are inactivated. If you have the ability to wear N95s, it's probably a good idea, not because the samples are going to make you sick in any way, but because it's possible that being around the nucleic acids, the genetic material, that you could end up with some of that in your nose or in your mouth, and that could potentially complicate or throw a false positive if you were to go get a test at the Alliant Energy Center that's also looking for those same nucleic acids. So like the biggest reason to wear an N95 is to avoid getting false positives if you yourself were to go get tested. This has happened at our workspace a couple of times now. So from a safety perspective, not really important, but if you have the ability to get fit tested, it's probably a good idea. Tom is our biosafety guru. What do you have to say to that?
I would agree with that, and I was unmuting already to add that really the safety risk, if there is one, is for somebody, if you're going to collect samples in person, and like have people go through a line as we have done up until now with our research study, then the person interacting with potentially positive people and maybe handling their samples, that person may be at some risk. And so that's why our Office of Biological Safety at UW has asked us to wear this personal protective equipment when we're dealing with the people participating in the study. I think that once you take the spit tube out of a bag and you basically you cook the virus is the very first step in the testing. Downstream from that, it should be quite safe. Other questions? So Toya says, question inside, outside, leaning towards families versus just kids or staff testing. You might have extra adults in or out of the building. Is there a possibility that if there's a greater volume in testing that the prices get reduced? Well, as Dave was saying about the prices, that they're really sort of locked in on the basis of the supplies you need to do the test. And it's difficult to realize a much greater discount until you start doing some pretty wild things. So we've talked about ways of like involving UW-Madison in actually making some of the reagents that you need to do the test at a tremendously large scale. So it would cost a lot of money to buy a giant batch of those reagents, but then the per test price would go down. But beyond that, you are in some sense locked into some of these prices.
One thing I will add, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just, the tests that they do at the Alliance and Public Health cost about $100 a test, and we get them free when we go there, but they do cost $100 a test. So you'd think that somebody somewhere would want to contribute to this relatively much cheaper test, although it's not a diagnostic test, it's not the same thing. But it would reduce the number of people going to the Alliance Center if more people had this testing.
That's actually part of our argument, like for why more people should get this kind of testing, is that it would save the expensive diagnostic testing for people who are likely to be positive.
Well, and let me add to that. So one other important point, and if it sounds like I'm insulting our own assay, it's because in a sense I am. The assay that we're doing is not it is not a sort of assay I ever thought we would be doing outside of like Sao Paulo or places where you don't have sophisticated lab infrastructure. Like we are driving this around in a mobile van because I've been in places where you have to drive infectious disease, testing around to people because you don't have centralized labs and you don't have sufficient hospital testing and what have you. I never in a million years thought we would be in an epidemic where that was the case here, but here we are. But what that also means is that, the government has bought 150 million antigen tests. Now those do require a nose swab, but those tests are basically the same sort of contagiousness tests that LAMP tests are. And it might well be that those tests are way better than LAMP tests. They might be easier, they might be more reliable. Instead of taking 30 minutes to run the assay plus like 30 minutes to 60 minutes to get them ready to run, maybe those give a readout in 10 or 15 minutes. And I've been aggressively pushing the governor's office, along with Tom and along with some other people from UW, to try to get access to those antigen tests, precisely to use them as sort of a version 2.0 of a LAMP test, where you have the same users, you know, you're still using it at a school, you're still having the school design the program, but you're using a different type of test that's even better. Originally, those tests were supposed to be available by mid-September. Well, they're not here yet. You know, originally they were going to be available for, you know, distribution to schools. It hasn't happened yet. So we're working on that. But in the future, those tests probably only cost a couple of pennies to manufacture, and they're getting sold for about $5. That's where you potentially realize a huge cost savings in moving to a test that probably only costs, you know, 20 cents to manufacture, that could be distributed for $1 or less. And so, you know, the expectation that we have with this whole franchise model is you figure out what the testing looks like, and then at some point you probably replace the test itself with one of these antigen tests that's going to be cheaper. But you know, we can't predict when that's going to be, because the real good tests for that don't exist yet, and the tests that do exist aren't in our hands yet. So that's when you're trying to think, like, what does this look like in April or May of next year? It probably looks like the same sort of program where you got to figure out, how are you going to test the kids? Who are you going to test? How frequently are you going to test them? Who's performing the test? But you probably replace the LAMP test with an antigen test.
Yeah, I think that the bottom line there is that the idea of contagiousness or infectiousness testing, where you test a couple times a week and see, you know, who might have the virus and be contagious but not know it yet, like that idea is really the key factor. And the tests that let you do that are probably going to get better and better. And the test that we've developed is okay, but we fully expect better tests to come available in the future. Toya, that is a really good question. Are there questions that should be asked that haven't been asked yet? And honestly, I'm not sure.
David, can you say something about who informed the families when a positive result is found, and what is the process when there is a positive result?
Yes, so I can tell you that for our research study, the way that this works right now is we have physicians who are part of our study team. So like when someone tests positive on our test, I call a doctor and say, I break the code. I say, this is the person who's tested positive. And the doctor then calls them and tells them that they need to isolate and urges them to go get a diagnostic test. How that would work on a surveillance test from one city is a little bit to be determined. Figuring out who would be in that role. Strictly speaking, it doesn't need to be a physician who does that. You know, it might be a role that someone like Maggie could play. It might also be that you have physicians who are part of your community or extended community who would be comfortable being in that role, so that that first point of contact is someone who's also very knowledgeable about the virus and all of the different dimensions around testing and care and follow-up, and can answer other questions that you know, people would be just more comfortable talking to a doctor about. So again, that's a sort of an implementation question.
I think we answered the question on turnaround, didn't we?
So Latoya also asked about what other questions should you be asking? I think we've covered the fact that, you know, we view this test as a Band-Aid, but as a conceptually important Band-Aid where, you know, right now, and again, I won't get on a soapbox. I know we've already been on the call for more than an hour, but our current testing is broken. The way that we're doing testing in this country is wrong. It's wrong that it costs $100 a test. It's wrong that it's not available to everyone. It's wrong that kids aren't in school. And it's especially wrong because the only thing that they tell you if you get a test is whether you're positive or negative. And the fact is, there's a huge difference between someone who's highly contagious who's likely to spread the virus to lots of other people. And the 70% of people, when they get a PCR positive, who aren't going to spread the virus to anyone because they're not actually shedding any live virus. And we treat all those people the exact same way. And until, Shelby, Tom, and I aren't going to be able to fix the fact that testing is broken nationally. What we can do, since we are virologists and this is sort of our bag, is we can try to help in our own backyard to figure out how to make this sort of contagiousness testing, a little bit more accessible, a little bit more available, show maybe how it can kind of work. And one of the things that's been the most satisfying to me of anything that we've done the last couple of months is, we talked about this back in late July with these, some other scientists down in Chicago, one of whom was on a school board. And he came up with the head of their teachers union the next week and saw us do the test and said, should we do this in our school? And they brought it back down and they talked about it at their school. And they set up what is really the inaugural franchise, right? They set it up for their school district because they were going back to school in end of August. And the guy who saw us give the talk is on the school board. And so he basically said, we need to do this because we just need some sort of testing. And so they tested 1,500 kids in the 4 days before kids went back to school, and they found 3 kids who were positive and didn't know it. And those kids got kept away from school and were subsequently found to be positive by PCR. They've continued to pick up a couple of kids every couple of weeks that they test. On a daily basis, I have no idea what's going on with their testing. I have no idea how many people they tested this week, and I have no idea how many people came up positive. But that's sort of the model that we want to get to, so that, we can eventually get to a point where one city has a testing program. And we're, of course, very interested in helping and very interested in seeing it succeed. But we want it to be a program that we don't have to think about very often because it sort of runs itself. And the fact that we've been able to do this in Chicago with the school district gives us confidence that we'll be able to do it. But we don't know. We haven't done it yet.
David, can we talk a little bit about the home kits? So in this moment, kind of when we start, we're going to start doing the collection of the samples in the school, in the entrance, or we need to figure out something that is logistically good for our school. But can you tell us about the home kit that you guys kind of are developing?
Yeah, so, and again, if we do this for a month or so and we, do it as part of our research study, we should be able to, give people the opportunity to try both forms of testing. Both the form where you spit on site, like when you walk into the school, and the form where you get some test kits to take home. And so basically the whole test kit, I don't have one here with me, but it's basically a little tube and then a little pointy straw. And then it comes in a little baggie with a little ethanol wipe or a little alcohol wipe. And so you just spit it home and then you wipe it off and you close the tube and you put it in the baggie and then you drop it in a box. And so, you drop it in a box when you enter the school. So we have, like, one of the boxes is sitting on my desk at work. We've put together some of the prototype kits. We haven't actually deployed them yet. That's a job. We're going to do that at our workplace next week for the first time. So, that's an option. Yesterday, Shelby did some just sort of user acceptance questioning when we were testing at a UW campus site. And you said that, like, a bunch of people were okay with home testing, but a bunch of people thought it would be more convenient to just spit in person. Is that about right?
Exactly. Yep.
So, the idea would be that over the course of, like, the 4 weeks where we can do it as research, we can expose people to some of the different possibilities. And that way you'll have a better sense for figuring out how you want to implement it. Do you want to go all take home or all in person or some combination of the two? Yeah. Anything else to add to that?
Nope, I don't think so. It's about right.
I'm like furiously typing over here, but
yeah, there's a lot of questions that have been coming in, Tom, I see, and I know we've gone on a while, and I hope we've addressed a lot of them. There's a lot of questions here currently about the consent form. And I think that, you know, if we're doing this under our research study, there would be a consent form, but you as one city would need to decide how you want to be able to enroll people in the study, which would be a separate issue.
Yeah, so like and again, we'll help with that. We have, you know, paperwork that we've put together for like what a surveillance consent form would look like. And if you wanted to say that, you know, the saliva gets destroyed the same day, that would be fine. It's your consent form to do with what you wish. For the 4 weeks where we're helping, we're not going to be, it's a whole process to modify the consent form that often takes months. We won't be able to modify the consent form for what we do over the next 4 weeks. But as we transition to having a one city run surveillance program, you'd be able to structure that however, you know, you're most comfortable.
Yeah, so in this moment, we're planning that I'm going to get trained with them, and I'm going to collaborate to do the to run the samples in the school. So then they are not going to be able to keep those samples. So after we have the results and everything, then we can just discard the samples, and we're not going to, as a school, we're not going to be interested to have any samples to do any other research or anything.
So what's the very next 3 steps?
Great question. So step number 1 is, you know, it sounds like I'm hearing a lot of enthusiasm, but it's also true that sometimes people who are less enthusiastic don't want to speak up in a forum like this. So the next thing that we do is we sign off this call, and y'all can go talk amongst yourselves about what, how the community feels about it. And we're prepared to come over when you're ready, if you decide that this is something that you're interested in, and do, you know, as we talked about, sort of our existing research testing for the next month or so, to, you know, show people what it's like, show what some of these different options like the take home versus not take home look like, and basically just introduce the idea. That's step 1. So like for us, we could do that next week. We could do it on Monday. If you know, Colleen talks to people and this is something that people are interested in or curious about or interested enough in that you want to see it in person, we can do that. We can do it really soon. The second step is we need to work with, we then at the same time as that, if this is something that's going to move forward and that people have an appetite for, you know, we need to have conversations between David and Colleen and their counterparts at UW-Madison. We just learned about this a couple of hours ago, so it's still subject to some refinement. What did they call it? It was a agreement of what was the term?
Cooperative agreement. It's a cooperative agreement.
Cooperative agreement. That's the one.
Began with a C.
So a cooperative agreement that basically outlines, you know, what a franchise, you know, like a franchised, you know, surveillance test looks like, and what, you know, the UW's role would be and what one city's role would be. And our goal would be, again, to, you know, make this as templated as possible so that while one city might be first, we would be using a version of the exact same thing with like all the different people who might want to bring this test on board. And my expectation is that that process would take, you know, a couple of weeks, best case, to maybe a month, worst case. But that's where, you know, once we get that in place, that's the point at which we'll be able to, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay, so that would be the point at which we would be able to turn it over to the one city run surveillance model. In the interim, we have to work to get Isabel and others who are interested in actually doing the implementation of the program trained up. And so that's something that would also happen during the sort of 4 weeks when we would be doing the, you know, the research covered, research approved version of the testing. So I would see those as the 3 next steps, but Tom, Shelby, did I miss anything?
I don't, oh, I think we also would have to figure out how to get them able to purchase the equipment they need, or how that would work, or, you know, because we were going to loan them equipment. That's a detail.
Yeah,
I think
so
that's a detail, especially if we're talking about a month kind of bridging process that we don't have to worry about right now. So
That's true.
that doesn't make it one of the 3 very next steps.
Sorry, I'm always thinking about like equipment and staffing and all that sort of stuff.
Somebody has to.
Yeah, I know.
Another thing, I don't know if we're going to talk about the run tests that we're going to do, or if it's after we figure out some things with Kalim and David, that if we're going to do the test with the staff and parents that want to know about how is the process, and maybe
Not the first thing that you mentioned, that you would come and,
Yep.
and like do it. So that would be the test run that would happen next week, where we would get 50 people or so who would come to the parking lot or something and do this. Is that right?
Exactly. So I think, we'd have to work out the exact details and schedule with you all, but that would be the idea, is that we could essentially, as part of our research study, show you how it works, and people could see how it works in the place where you'd want to do it there. What the process is. We could learn about how, if there are any things we need to figure out about how to make it happen in your place. And so we'd all kind of learn about that together.
Yeah, we don't want to be presumptuous. We know that, when we came over earlier in the week, we were told that Monday afternoons usually are sort of half days. So we could do it as soon as Monday, this coming Monday, but we don't want to do anything that seems presumptuous or rushed. So if you'd rather wait a week, we could do that too. So we are geared up to do it on Monday, or if you want to wait a week Monday, we could do it then too. Assuming you want to do this at all. Again, we're trying to be very, very careful about not overstepping and making sure that we're letting this be a community-led process where we're helping as much as we can without trying to impose in any way.
However, after you guys talk amongst yourselves, if we could communicate over the weekend so I can let people know if we need their staff support on Monday or not, that would be very useful. Again, staffing and supplies that I think about a lot.
Well, while the parents think about Marilyn's question, I'll just say one last thing, and to amplify Dave's point. We understand that maybe the folks who call into something like this are the ones who are most excited about it. And so if there are people with concerns, it's really important that we understand what those are. And so we're not, while we think this is a really important way that we can bring testing to people, and we obviously really strongly believe in the idea of infectiousness testing. If people have worries about it, we'd like to make sure that they have a chance to voice their concerns. So while we could totally, we are ready to do it on Monday, but if that ends up being too soon, that's okay. So this is a decision process that we want to do with everybody.
So there was a question about whether there were downstream impacts to the test other than false positives. And like if the question is, does the actual act of spitting and us doing the test on the spit impact the individual besides telling them they might be positive? No. There's some anxiety if you're told you might be positive and then maybe you have to stay home from school for a couple days until you get a diagnostic test. But that is that issue with a false positive that was raised. So that's the biggest downside, is the anxiety surrounding the potential for a false positive that would come up.
That's exactly what's in our consent form for the research study. Is the biggest risk we can see to people who are in the research study is that if there's a false positive, they may worry for a couple of days, or they may decide to stay home from work for a couple of days, and it turns out that if they test negative, maybe they didn't have to do that.
And this question about having the forms in Spanish makes a ton of sense. I couldn't do that because I don't speak Spanish, but I'm sure that could be done.
Well, so again, I think there's two things here. So will it be ready for Monday? No, because it would still have to be approved in Spanish by the IRB, which will not happen because they don't work at that pace. But again, that's the thing that you work towards, so that in a month's time you have it in Spanish. I don't think we have it in Spanish.
I don't think
so.
I
so.
But we do have, I'll send this to Kaleem to share. we do have a, in the Chicago area where our test is being used, they made a YouTube video in English and in Spanish for this reason, to provide education. Let me talk about some other things that could go wrong, just because this is how I think about the world. There's a bunch of things that could go wrong. What are other bad things that can happen? A bad thing that could happen is you could test 70 samples and somehow the run gets completely contaminated. And so on a given day, you learn nothing from the results because for whatever reason, and I'm not casting aspersions on anyone. It happens to everyone. You might have a contamination issue and you won't be able to get usable data out of a particular set of samples. I don't think we had one case one day in like late August where that happened, and it sucked.
We solved all of our problems, but they sucked.
Yeah, I mean, we solved that problem ourselves by retesting the next day. But it's a problem because then you have people who came in expecting that they would find out if they had a potential finding of significance, and we couldn't give them an answer, and that felt really crummy. So that's something that can happen if for whatever reason a testing doesn't work on a particular day. We talked about false positives. There is a possibility that you could be a false negative on a Monday because your virus is on the way up, and you might still miss that with our test. And so you could then be contagious on Tuesday or Wednesday. That's sort of inherent in any kind of testing program, is you wouldn't necessarily, you can't think about this as offering perfect protection. The way that we think about it is that, it gets you maybe 80% of the way to, protection. And we try to set the expectation that, if this works according to like our best hypothesis for how this would work, is it will reduce the risk of being in school with testing to the risk that you would have if you were, in your house virtual schooling without testing. That doesn't mean it reduces it to zero. And so making sure that, people understand that you're still likely going to have some cases, even if you have testing, even if it's twice a week. I think you don't need to look any further than the White House to see that daily testing alone is not a solution, that solves things 100% of the time. So just making sure that people understand, what the program can do and don't have unrealistically high expectations, I think is just really, really important.
And someone had asked, but I think that it's important more towards Kaleem about what happens if a student comes back positive or false positive, even, I guess, what happens to the class and quarantining and those sorts of things. But I think that's probably a Kaleem question.
Well, that's something.
Oh, go ahead, Thomas.
Well, I just think that those are things that we do have to work out with the school. And so, like, if we were to do this starting on Monday, theoretically, like what would happen if someone tested positive is a really good question. And that's something we'd have to talk about with you guys. Sorry, Kaleem.
That's what I was going to say is, well, that's a question I don't want to just give you an answer to without understanding the implications of whatever decision we make. The goal is to have the kids come to school. That's the ultimate goal, and to be able to keep them here as much as possible. So whatever allows us to be able to do that with as much assurance of safety as possible is the answer we would give yes to. We have to figure out what that is.
We are coming at 90 minutes since we started. We so appreciate all of you taking the time out. These are great questions. Now you can see why we're getting excited about this potential study here, and that we'll be the only school, open public school, that provide this. So this is huge. This is a huge deal here, and we want to make sure that everyone's feeling comfortable with this. So Kaleem or David, any last minute thoughts, and thanking our guests for being on the line here with us?
David,
well, I would say that just for the last minute thoughts is that one of the reasons that we really wanted to have this phone call is to make sure that we are thinking everything through. There's a lot of questions that we can't just materialize for ourselves, but we know that there's going to be a lot of questions that everybody has about a testing program like this. So I guess in a lot of ways, this is just the very beginning. We'll take all of these questions under advisement, and then get back with you all to tell you our thinking through it, and we may have to make revisions on that plan as well. But bottom line is, as Kaleem said, our goal is to keep everybody in the building as safe as possible. And we feel really good about this being one method that we can use towards that end. So we're going to continue as quickly as possible to get this rolled out so that we can continue on, as we're the only school right now. We have and we've seen the results already. So we know that we need to keep doing this.
And ideally, when would this start?
Well, ideally, I would say within weeks, right? So originally we had thought maybe this call would take place earlier this week, and we had identified Monday as being potentially a good day to do a rollout with maybe our staff or a smaller group of parents at pickup. So we might still have a time next week where we're doing a small sample just to demonstrate really what this looks like. And you all could be invited out for a demonstration, but maybe it'd be a smaller sample size. And perhaps the subsequent week or the week after would be when we're starting to collect samples from students. At that time, I would be hoping that everybody's parent questions are answered regarding what's happening with the sample, what do we do if there's a false positive, and how might that impact other students in quarantining classrooms. I think those are the things that we really have to still think through in a more granular way and discuss openly with you all, so that we're not making this a hindrance to keeping students in the building, but a way that we can keep more in the building.
And we have kind of a 4-week period when David and Kaleem will be working with folks from the UW-Madison to develop a cooperative agreement that outlines what a franchise surveillance test might look like. So we have that 4 weeks to kind of orient ourselves to the next steps.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Correct, yeah.
And to train Isabel.
All right, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your time.
Thanks. It was great talking with you all.
Bye now.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Maryland, one city's got the tightest parents.
Telling you, bye.
I'm still here. Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie, Isabel, David, team.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Good night.
Thank you. You.
Bye, Hilda.
Chat. Okay. Bye-bye. Nice. Nice.
Are you going to save the chat, Marilyn?
Of course, all the time. All the time on
What's
there.
up, Lucy?
What's up on there? Bye, bye, goodbye. All right, yes, okay. Way to go, team. Everyone seems excited. Let's go. Let's go, man.
That's what I'm saying.
Let's go.
I'm ready to spit rhymes.
I ain't spitting nothing. I ain't not spitting anything. I'm gonna stop the